Anti-tank warfare arose as a result of the need to develop technology and tactics to destroy tanks during the First World War. Since the first tanks were developed by the Allies in 1916 but not principally used till 1917, the first anti-tank weapon was developed by Germany. It was a scaled-up bolt-action rifle designated the Mauser Tankgewehr Model 1918 that fired a 13mm cartridge with a solid bullet that could penetrate the thin armor of tanks of the time and destroy the engine or ricochet inside, killing occupants. Because tanks represent an enemy's greatest force projection, anti-tank warfare has been incorporated into the doctrine of nearly every combat service since. The predominant anti-tank weapons at the start of the Second World War were the tank-mounted gun, limbered anti-tank guns and anti-tank grenades used by the infantry, as well as ground attack aircraft such as the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. Anti-tank warfare evolved rapidly, particularly on the Eastern Front, to include new infantry and infantry support weapons such as the bazooka, anti-tank combat engineering, specialized anti-tank aircraft and self-propelled anti-tank guns. Both the Soviet Red Army and the German Army developed methods of combating tank-led offensives, including deployment of static anti-tank weapons embedded in in-depth defensive positions, protected by anti-tank obstacles and minefields, and supported by mobile anti-tank reserves and ground attack aircraft. From the Korean War to the Cold War, the United States, Soviet Union and other countries faced the possibility that a nuclear weapon could be detonated over an area of tank concentration in one strike. While technology was developed to protect crews of armored vehicles from the effects of radiation, the same could not be done for all their supporting arms and the supply train on which tanks depend for spares, fuel and maintenance. In the NATO countries, little if any development took place on defining a doctrine of how to use armed forces without the use of tactical nuclear weapons. In the Soviet sphere of influence, the legacy doctrine of operational maneuver was being theoretically examined to understand how a tank-led force could be used even with the threat of limited use of nuclear weapons on the European battlefield. The solution they arrived at was maneuver warfare while massively increasing the number of anti-tank weapons. To achieve this, Soviet military theorists realized that anti-tank weapons had to assume an offensive role rather than the traditionally defensive role of the Great Patriotic War by becoming more mobile. This led to the development of improved guided anti-tank missiles. Though similar design work was being performed in Western Europe and the United States, the French SS-10 missile was the first successfully used in anti-tank combat by the Israel Defense Forces during the Suez Crisis of 1956. But the impact of Soviet anti-tank missile tactics was not evident until 1973, when Russian 9K-11 Malyutka missiles were used by the Egyptian and Syrian armies during the Yom Kippur War against Israel. The outcome suggested that although the French missiles were a threat, they could be countered. The explosive power delivered by the missiles convinced NATO tank designers to continue their emphasis on increased armor, while Soviet designers retained their emphasis on mobility of tank-led forces. The utility of the light anti-tank weapon was also recognized by both sides of the Cold War and led to further development of man-portable weapons used by the infantry squad, while heavier missiles were mounted on dedicated missile tank destroyers, including dedicated anti-tank helicopters, and even heavier guided anti-tank missiles launched from aircraft. Also being developed were new varieties of artillery munitions in the form of top attack shells, and shells that were used to saturate areas with anti-armor bomblets. Helicopters could be used as well to rapidly deliver scattered anti-tank mines. Since the end of the Cold War in 1993, the only major new threats to tanks and other armored vehicles has been the remotely detonated improvised explosive devices used in asymmetric warfare and weapon systems like the RPG-29 and FGM-148 Javelin, which can defeat reactive armor or shell armor. The latter weapon systems use a tandem warhead where the first stage of the tandem warhead activates the reactive armor, and the second stage of the tandem warhead defeats the shell armor by means of a high-explosive anti-tank shaped charge. Tank threat. The tank had been developed to negate the German system of trenches, and allow a return to maneuver against enemies' flanks and to attack the rear with cavalry. The use of the tank was primarily based on the assumption that once they were able to eliminate the German trench lines with their machine gun and infantry support gun positions, the Allied infantry would follow and secure the breach, and the cavalry would exploit the breach in the trench lines by attacking into the depth of German-held territory, eventually capturing the field artillery positions and interdicting logistics and reserves being brought up from the rear areas. Naval crews initially used to operate the installed naval guns and machine guns were replaced with army personnel who were more aware of the infantry tactics with which the tanks were intended to cooperate. However, there was no way to communicate between the tank's crew and the accompanying infantry, or between the tanks participating in combat. Radios were not yet made portable or robust enough to be mounted in a tank, although Morse code transmitters were installed in some Mark IVs at Cambrai as messaging vehicles. Attaching a field telephone to the rear would become a practice only during the next war. With greater use of tanks by both sides, it was realized that the accompanying infantry could be forced to ground by ambush fire, thus separating them from the tanks, which would continue to advance, eventually finding themselves exposed to close assaults by German infantry and sappers. The early tanks were mechanically rudimentary. The 0.23 to 0.47 inch thick armor generally prevented penetration by small arms fire and shell fragments. However, even a near miss from a field artillery or an impact from a mortar round easily disabled the tank, or destroyed it if the fuel tank was ruptured, incinerating the tank's crew. A large-caliber gun was recognized as a tactical necessity to attack machine gun positions and defeat any infantry field pieces found in the trench lines which could easily disable tank track with the HE ammunition. This was achieved by mounting a QF 6-pounder Hotchkiss light 57mm naval gun mounted in the hull barbets. Hull and track engineering was largely dictated by the terrain, the need to cross wide trenches, although the relationship between ground pressure and soil vehicle mechanics was not resolved until the Second World War. Turrets were later introduced on medium and light tanks to react to ambushes during the advance. First World War. The French Army staff was highly critical of the British Army's early fielding of the Mark I vehicles in small numbers because the French trials showed the armored vehicles to be highly unreliable. They judged that large numbers had to be employed to sustain an offensive despite losses to mechanical failure or vehicles being founded in intractable no-man's land terrain. These losses, coupled with those from enemy artillery fire, later amounted to as high as 70% of the starters during some operations. Deploying small numbers of tanks would therefore cause the Allies to lose the element of surprise, allowing Germans to develop countermeasures, anti-tank weapons, because the German army was the only force in need of anti-tank weapons. It was they that had to develop a viable technology to combat the tank. These technologies took three ammunition approaches. Use of grenades by infantrymen, including the Geballte-Ladung of several stick grenades bound together by pioneers. Early attempts at the small-caliber anti-tank rifles like the 13 mm Mauser bolt action, and 3.7 cm TAC Rheinmetall Installer Lafette 1916 anti-tank gun on a light carriage which could destroy a tank using large-caliber armor-piercing ammunition issued in 1917 to Special Commands, and the existing 77 mm field guns of the Infantry Division's artillery regiment were also eventually issued with special armor-piercing ammunition. Anti-tank tactics. With the appearance of Allied tanks, the German army were quick to introduce new anti-tank defense detachments within the pioneer battalions of the infantry divisions. These were initially issued 1.3 cm caliber long-barrel rifles firing solid shot. However, these suffered from fouling after 2 to 3 rounds and had a recoil that was unsustainable by the mechanism or the rifleman. Stick grenades were used to destroy the tracks by individual pioneers. However, this required for accompanying machine gunners to first separate the supporting Allied infantry line from the tanks, which proved difficult. Another tactic was to lure the tank beyond the German trench line, re-establishing it just as the Allied infantry approached. The tank would then be engaged by the divisional 7.7 cm guns brought forward, that would try to disable the tracks with ordinary HE shells. If the crews of the disabled tanks refused to surrender, they were engaged with flamethrowers, or a mortar would be fired on the stricken vehicle until a direct hit was achieved on the top surface, usually resulting in an internal fire. Finally, anti-tank obstacles were prepared on the likely approaches by deepening and widening existing ground cratering, the precursors of the anti-tank trench. Finally, in early 1917, the 3.7 cm TAC from Rheinmetall was rushed to the front line, and proved effective in destroying the tanks despite limited elevation and traverse. Development between the World Wars. Lack of consensus on the design and use of the tank after the First World War also influenced the development of its anti-tank countermeasures. However, because Germany was restricted by the Treaty of Versailles in its military capability, and there were no other challenges to France and Britain, very little development took place in anti-tank warfare until the 1930s. The interwar period was dominated by the strategic thinking with fortified borders at its core. These included obstacles consisting of natural features such as ditches, streams and urban areas, or constructed obstacles such as anti-tank ditches, minefields, dragon's teeth, or log barriers. The pinnacle of this strategic thinking was considered to be the Maginot Line, which replaced infantry-filled trenches with artillery-filled bunkers, including casemates housing 37 or 47 mm anti-tank guns, and steel turrets armed with a pair of machine guns and a 25 mm anti-tank gun. Although Germany was forbidden to produce tanks, the construction was partially based on the Allied experience with the Hindenburg Line, which was breached with tank support during the battles of Cambrai and St. Quentin Canal, although German command was more impressed by the surprise achieved by the Canadian troops at the Battle of the Canal du Nord. This came to influence their planning in 1940. The Maginot Line defenses, up to 25 kilometers deep from the forward positions to the rear line, were intended to prevent a surprise attack and delay any attack while the French army was mobilized. With the relative numerical inferiority between France and Germany, it was a more effective use of manpower. Within the line, passive anti-tank obstacles were supported by anti-infantry and anti-tank bunkers. After Belgium declared neutrality in 1936, France began work on extending the line along the Belgian border. Improved artillery was seen as the quickest solution to anti-tank defense, and one of the earliest post-war anti-tank gun designs was the 25 mm Hotchkiss model from France. It was intended to replace an Atelier de Putter 37 mm weapon designed in 1916 to destroy machine gun positions. Rheinmetall commenced design of a 37 mm anti-tank gun in 1924, and the first guns were produced in 1928 as 3.7 cm Pak L-45, later adopted in Wehrmacht service as 3.7 cm Pak 36. It made an appearance during the Spanish Civil War, as did the Bofors 37 mm developed in Sweden, and used by many early Second World War combatants. The British Army accepted for service the Ordnance QF 2-pounder, which was developed as a tank gun. The Soviet Red Army after the Russian Civil War also began a search for an anti-tank gun with a French Hotchkiss 37 mm L-33 tank gun, but soon upgraded this to a higher velocity L-45 model 1935, while also making a licensed copy of the German 3.7 cm Pak 36. However, the Red Army was almost immediately taught a lesson about anti-tank warfare when a tank battalion sent to aid the Spanish Republicans in the Spanish Civil War was almost entirely destroyed in an engagement. At this time, the predominant ammunition used against tanks was the armor-piercing kinetic energy shell that defeated armor by direct pressure, spiking or punching through it. During the late 1930s, shaped charge ammunition was experimented with that used chemical energy for armor penetration. The shaped charge concept is officially known as the Monroe effect, and was discovered by accident decades earlier by Professor Charles E. Monroe at the U.S. Torpedo Station, Providence, Rhode Island. Professor Monroe was detonating different manufactured blocks of explosives on a sheet of armor plating and observed the blocks having the manufacturing letters recessed, cut an imprint of the manufacturing letters into the armor plate, the birth of the shaped charged explosive, which focuses the blast energy caused by an indentation on the surface area of an explosive. Although shaped charges are somewhat more difficult to manufacture, the advantage is that the projectile does not require high velocity as typical kinetic energy shells, yet on impact it creates a high-velocity jet of molten metal which creates tremendously high pressures and heat, hydrodynamically penetrating the armor and killing occupants inside. The depth of the penetration, though proportional to the length of the jet and the square root of its density, is also dependent on the strength of the armor. With the development of this new ammunition began more advanced research into steel manufacturing, and development of spaced armor that caused jet waver by detonating prematurely or at the wrong angle to the surface of the main armor. The only significant attempt to experiment in the use of tanks in the late 1920s was that of the British Army's experimental mechanized force that influenced future development of tanks, armored troops and entire armies of both its future enemies and allies in the next war. In Spain, the anti-tank defense of the nationalists was organized by the Wehrmacht officers, and the anti-tank guns were incorporated into a system of obstacles that were constructed with the intent to stop an attack by tanks by slowing it down, separating them from supporting infantry with machine gun and mortar fire, and forcing tanks to conduct deliberate head-on assaults with engineer support, or seek a less defended area to attack. Delay meant that nationalist field artillery could engage the lightly armored Soviet tanks. This meant a change in Republican operational and eventually strategic planning, and a more protracted combat operations, with more casualties at a greater cost. The only change to the German anti-tank tactics of the First World War was that now an effective anti-tank weapon was available to support the defending infantry. However, the Soviet tanks armed with 45 mm guns easily destroyed the German light tanks. Ironically, in the early 1930s until the Spanish War, German officers were conducting secret testing of a new way of employing tanks, infantry and artillery offensively in the Soviet Union with the cooperation of the Red Army. In Germany, these developments eventually culminated in tactics that later came to be known as Blitzkrieg, while in the Soviet Union they formed the core of the deep battle operational doctrine. The successful test of the latter was during the battles of Kharkhin Gol, although the Red Army founded on the Mannerheim Line in 1940. Largely due to the purge in the officer corps, claiming many of the senior proponents of the new doctrine, anti-tank artillery would be included in mobile tank-led Wehrmacht in Red Army units due to the possibility of encountering enemy tanks in a meeting engagement. The new doctrines of using the tank were divided into infantry and cavalry schools of thought. The former regarded the tank as a mobile artillery system to be used for infantry support. This suggested that the infantry needed to be armed with integral anti-tank weapons. The latter advocated use of tanks in the traditional cavalry way of high-tempo attacks intended to outflank the enemy infantry and sever its communication lines. This approach suggested that the tank was the best anti-tank system, and only limited anti-tank troops were required to accompany them. For this reason, the late 30s tank configurations came in a great diversity, ranging from light tankettes and cavalry tanks to multi-turreted heavy tanks resembling bunkers, all of which had to be considered in training by the anti-tank artillery troops. The development of these doctrines was the most significant influence on the rapid development in anti-tank technology and tactics in the Second World War.